Welcome back, everybody. Today's topic is going to focus on our motor and sensory systems. We are going to be able to link this topic to our past sections, in particular looking at biology and growth, but also we're going to be able to segue this section into our future sections, and that's information processing and cognition. Please, as usual, keep paying attention throughout the entire presentation, and if things get tough or there's other things that you just don't quite understand, pause and either email me or review these slides a couple times until you get the material at the level you're supposed to understand it. Alright, on to today's class. As mentioned in the beginning, today we're going to focus in on our motor and our sensory systems, but when we look at the concept of motor or sensory systems, we also typically pair that with our perceptual system as well. And when we focus in on the sensory system and perception at the end of this class today, you'll understand why those two things are actually paired with each other. However, despite the fact that we're going over a new topic, we've already started to look at this topic in previous classes. In the last class, we talked about the concept of the development of the nervous system and how these things change, how they become more elaborate, and how we gain a lot of abilities as we progress throughout the lifespan. This concept of nervous system development actually wraps up the motor and sensory systems within it. However, the motor and sensory systems are very, very specific parts of our nervous system. So in today's class, we're going to split up this section, the course, the weekly class, into two sections. We're going to talk first about our motor developments. We'll focus in on gross motor development and fine motor development. And then after that, we take a break and come back and focus in on our sensory and perceptual systems. Each of them are fairly related to each other. We're going to show in a second here the biology of this system and where they're linked to each other, but they do act distinctly from each other, and there's some very big differences in development that we see with the two of them. So we typically in a developmental psychology class address them in separate sections. Now, the reason why we spend so much time focusing in on this movement and touch for sensory system within the nervous system is because this particular part of our body, this particular aspect of our nervous system, our central nervous system, is very, very important for us. It gives us a lot of very specific benefits that we get from having these two particular systems. One of the big things that we get with both our sense of touch and our sense of movement is the ability to interact with the environment. We can talk, we can interact by touching things, we can move, and we can essentially experience and cause change within our environment due to these two particular systems. Another big plus with these two systems, one that's absolutely critical for our development, is the ability to detect danger and prevent injuries through our sensory system. If we feel pain, if we feel heat, our brain is actually hardwired to change our behavior, to activate our motor system in order to avoid those sources of pain. And one last benefit of these two systems, one that doesn't have much to do with interacting with things or detecting danger, is that we can also derive pleasure from some of our sensory nervous systems. Our eyes can take in things that are enjoyable. We can feel things that are pleasurable. We can experience a lot of things within our environment that we prefer due to our ability to both move our body and sense things that are going on in our environment. So we focus in on this system, and it's a major part of our nervous system, and it's included within our central nervous system. Now, this concept of the central nervous system is something we've talked about earlier, but before today's class, we focused in a lot on one primary aspect of our central nervous system, and that's the brain. It's true that our brain is a big, big part of our central nervous system, and in fact, if we didn't have our brain communicating with the rest of our body, the rest of our central nervous system would be useless. But in addition to having that brain, for our motor and sensory systems, we need another part of our central nervous system. And this is a two-part system that contains the spinal cord and the nerves that are actually used to communicate with each other. The spinal cord is more of a support system for the nervous system, the nerves that connect to the brain and throughout the body. But this area is absolutely essential for us to be able to use both our motor and sensory systems. If we look at the brain and we look at the body of the nervous system, and closer in this picture, we can see how the spinal cord and the sensory nervous system is actually paramount for us to be able to interact with our environment. If we look even closer at the spine, in the next slide you'll see, we have threads traveling all the way up and down the spine connecting to different areas of our body. As you can see in this picture, they go all the way around the neck, the shoulders, down the back, and throughout the rest of our body, even down to the leg and some of our extremity systems. And these connections are what allow us to feel everything in our body and also move everything in our body at the same time. If we look closer at the spinal cord, as you can see in the lower left-hand corner, we actually have two paths of fibers or nerves in our system that allow us to be able to interact with our body. The first area is called the sensory or afferent root, which is on the back portion of our system. So if we think the very, very back, or it's also called the dorsal portion of our body, we actually have nerves connected to our spinal cord that are responsible for taking in all the signals from our body. And these sensory nerves connect all the way from our lower back, all the way up to our neck, and all the way right into our brain. And almost every single nerve cell that we have in our body actually travels on this path. The other certain nerves that we need for our motor system are the ones in our efferent root, or we call this the ventral route, or the forward route of our body. These nerves are responsible for communicating information from our brain to the rest of our body. So if we want to move our head, if we want to tilt our torso, if we want to flail our arms or move our fingers or wiggle our toes, all of the nerves that are responsible for doing that are coming down this ventral route. So when we look at our sensory system and our motor system, they're connected to the spinal cord, but they're actually traveling on slightly different paths. The dorsal root, or the afferent root, is responsible for sensation, and the ventral root is responsible for the actual movement of the body. There are some small exceptions to that, and you can actually see it in the right-hand side, where we have specific nerves that don't actually travel down the spinal cord. Now, as you can see, there's a bunch of these different nerves. You don't need to memorize any of these, but I do want to show you guys a slight exception to this spinal cord to brain communication, and that's in something called cranial nerves. Cranial nerves actually attach directly to the brain, and they control some very basic functioning of the face mostly, and also some functioning of our internal system as well. These nerves, these small number of nerves, the 12 different systems that we have, are the only nerves that don't connect our body to our brain through the spinal cord. Every other nerve that we have in our body, somewhere in our spinal cord, actually gets attached and goes up a specific path until it reaches our brain.
Now, if we look closer at the brain and our sensory and motor systems, what we see is it's actually divided even more once we get up to that upper region. In fact, in our brains, we've got two particular areas, one for sensory systems, one for motor systems, that are dedicated to really controlling the touch and the movement that we control throughout our body, or we experience throughout our entire body. The touch system, which you see pictured in the left-hand side, involves all the different organs and different parts of our body that can actually experience touch. Now, for the most part, if you look at the picture, you're going to see a lot of these touch systems on this somatosensory system is related to actual skin contact. But we do have some internal things as well, if you go to the bottom portion of that strip of the brain, that also are involved in our sensory systems and allow us to detect things like strain in the abdomen or other issues that are going on internally. And this particular system is absolutely critical for us to be able to function correctly, and it takes a little bit of time to develop. So in addition to needing to have our afferent systems, our sensory systems, and our dorsal systems kind of working, we also need to have our somatosensory system working so we can successfully make sense of what's going on in our environment. And the same thing is said with our motor system, which is located just in front of that sensory system. It's actually part of the frontal lobe, or at least just barely touching the frontal lobe of the brain, which is the very front region of the brain. And there you see actually a decent amount of overlap between what we talked about with the sensory system and what we talked about with the movement system. But what's really interesting is if you look at the two pictures depicted on the bottom, even though there's a lot of overlap, the overlap actually isn't perfect. And that's because in some regions of the brain, we actually dedicate more space to touch than we do to movement. And in other places, we actually dedicate way more energy to movement than we do to touch. So you've got this tiny little sliver of the touch system dedicated to the eyes, because feeling things is actually really difficult to do in the eyes. In fact, you can't really detect pressure, which is a weird thing that you can actually try out if you want to. It's kind of weird, but if you turn your eye to the side and kind of pull down your eyelid so it's just covering half of your eye, and push very gently, don't squeeze the eyeball, but very gently push the eyeball, you actually can't feel that change in pressure. So if you just have the one eye open and you push it, you're actually going to experience the visual sensation of movement, because you don't have a lot of sensory cells connected to the eye that can help you detect those things. And there's issues like that throughout the body. But for movement, you've got other areas that are highly concentrated, so allow you to kind of control movement or adjust to things more successfully. And obviously, if you look at these pictures, another area that you see that gets a lot of dedication in your brain is the hands. And all of this stuff has to kind of work itself out. Experience can dictate which parts of your brain kind of get allocated to specific types of resources. But when we're talking about the developmental process and all the nerves going to the brain, a big part of this developmental process and the complexity to it is actually what's happening inside the brain.
As we grow, as we age, and these two systems become much more complex, we're actually going through a process that we call maturation. Maturation, in terms of a definition, is qualified as being development that results from two big things: experience and genetics. Now, social maturation is something that we typically think of when we think of adolescents and adults, but in the motor and sensory system, maturation is also extremely important. We need to grow, we need to be able to become much more complex as we age. And a lot of scientists believe that this growth is a product of two things: experience, a need to do specific things, and also a part of genetics. So our body actually changing, altering in a natural unfolding pattern. The reason why this takes place, a lot of researchers believe, is a product of something that we call the dynamic systems theory, or dynamic systems hypothesis. This hypothesis proposed that we mature in both perception and action because of two big things: seeing things that we want and finding a way to actually achieve those goals or those things that we that we desire. So first we have to grow in perception, the ability to see things, the ability to recognize stimuli that are desirable, and then we have to grow in actions, the ability to actually move, the ability to actually control our behavior. Once that's happened, we actually will see growth in the individual. Now, when a child is born, they really do have very few tools available to them, at least in terms of control of their motor system. But one thing they do have going for them is that all children, almost all children, have a number of built-in reactions that they have to stimuli that we call reflexes. And these reflexes, even though they don't protect the child entirely from some of the outside concerns that they might face, it does allow a child to kind of alleviate some of the problems and actually increase its chances of surviving without actually doing anything consciously to interact with their environment. And when we look at these built-in reactions or reflexes, what we see is that each child, if born healthy without many problems, usually displays a number of reflexes. 3 of the primary reflexes that children display are something called the rooting reflex, the sucking reflex, and the Moro reflex. The rooting reflex occurs when you stroke a child's cheek, and that child is impelled to move its face toward whatever side of the cheek was being stroked. And there's a belief that this allows the child not only to kind of move in the direction of what the attachment was, or what the contact was from, but also be able to produce the next reflex, which is critical, and that's the sucking reflex. And that's when an object is placed in the child's mouth. When the child gets its mouth on whatever usually it was rooting towards, the instant sucking motion allows a child to get some of the nutrition that it needs without having to consciously think about that actual behavior. And both the rooting and sucking reflex are extremely important in young children in terms of survival and really the basic function that a child needs to have in order to make it through its first couple of years, or like its first couple months of life. The other reflex, one that's a little bit different and one that's kind of unusual, is something called the Moro reflex. This reflex isn't quite as essential, but it did have a very important value in the past. And what we see with the Moro reflex is a very specific response of the child's head and arms and legs to a couple situations. Usually, the Moro reflex is produced when a child is startled, but also if a child feels a sensation of falling, the Moro reflex will also occur. And this arching of the back, kind of throwing back of the head, and the extension of the arms and legs theoretically allows the child to kind of be caught or be braced a little bit more easily than they would if they didn't have this particular reflex. All of these reflexes go away, just like most of them, but there's some other ones that have also been identified over the last couple of years. Some of these other reflexes that we see have kind of unique names to them. One of them is called the palmar grasp, and when we see the palmar grasp, what we view in children is that touching the palm of the hand with any object or just any brush causes the child to instantly grasp around that object or that material that it made contact with. The other thing that's very similar to the palmar grasp is something called the plantar grasp, or it's also sometimes known as the Babinski, where if you touch the sole of the foot of a child, it actually causes the toes to spread out, usually the fifth is, or the big toe, to actually move in, and the foot to curve inward as well. Two other reflexes, ones that are a little bit more difficult to see and less common, are something called, well, not less common, but less tested, or something called the stepping reflex. And that's when you place a child's foot on a flat surface. It actually, for some reason, causes the legs, the motor system in the legs of these children, to produce something that almost looks like a walking pattern. And the stepping reflex also disappears fairly quickly within these children. And the last reflex, one that's very surprising to parents, sometimes kind of cute, is something called the swimming reflex. Now, I wouldn't suggest testing your child on this, even though almost all children do have the swimming reflex, but obviously the consequences of not displaying like a swimming reflex is big for children. But what we see with children is that when we place them in water, there's some automatic reflex that they have within them that allows them to stroke their legs and arms as if they're swimming when they're placed underwater, and also hold their breath without consciously thinking about it. And we're not sure where this is coming from. We're assuming this involves something within the wound, but this is one of the other reflexes that we see in young children. Now, we mentioned the swimming reflex goes away, but actually all of these reflexes that are there at birth usually disappear at about 3 to 4 months of age. In fact, the only one that doesn't disappear at about 3 to 4 months of age from the ones that we've listed is the sucking reflex. In fact, that one typically lasts until about 1 to 4 years of age, where most children typically will get rid of it by about the age of 2. That sucking reflex is one that's okay for it to remain, but the other reflexes, if they don't disappear at about 3 to 4 months, typically signals to developmental psychologists and biologists that there's a specific problem with the nervous system development of a child. So not having a reflex is a problem, but in addition to not having a reflex being a problem, having a reflex remain for too long also indicates that there's probably a nervous system development issue. So when we look at reflexes, we can not only see these as a great mechanisms for survival, but we can also use the prevalence of these reflexes as an indication of proper growth within these children. However, in addition to having these reflexes that go away, some reflexes that children naturally have actually stay with us throughout our lives. We might not think of these things as reflexes, but coughing, sneezing, blinking, shivering, and yawning are all reflexes that children are born with, and they're ones that never go away. So all of us, no matter who you are, should have the ability to do all of these different reflexes, and they're there for survival purposes throughout our lives. Now, as stated earlier though, when babies are born, when we have new infants, even though we do have some of that pre-wired connections, those reflexes, a lot of infancy is dominated by a lack of control, lack of ability to move the body. And in particular, when we look at moving the body, what we often do is focus in on two major categories, or really differentiate movement in two different ways. The first major classification of motor system ability is something called gross motor skills. And these are skills and movements that involve very large muscle activity. So moving a leg, moving your head, tilting, standing up, all of these are example of gross motor skills. And for children, at birth, in very, very early stages of infancy, there's very little growth motor skill capability. But as the neurons in the nervous system start to connect, as the brain and our peripheral nervous systems start to communicate with each other, infants gain the ability to do a couple basic gross motor skills. And when we look at human development, even though everybody doesn't follow an exact pattern on when specific gross motor skills actually develop, what we see across large samples of individuals is that these developments happen in very, very close proximity to get into each other. Another thing that we see with gross motor skill development is that they happen in a very set pattern. So when we look at some of these developmental stages in the next couple slides, I want you to appreciate that it doesn't always happen at exactly the points in time that are listed here, but it happens fairly close to these times, and very rarely does an infant, and later on a child, develop gross motor skills in different orders. So one typically comes before the other. In infancy, when we look at the major gross motor skills that we're interested in, posture is the big thing that kids first need to develop. So at about 2 weeks of age, our first gross motor skill ability actually takes shape, where children are able to hold their own heads, to look at things in a small extent, but mostly the big focus is being able to hold the head, being able to stand it on end so you don't have to constantly focus on holding a child's head. And this develops at about 2 weeks of age. Before this, parents are required, if they want their child's head to stay upright, to actually hold and cradle the head. After those 2 weeks of developing neck muscles and starting to gain some muscle in the rest of their bodies, including their abdomen, their backs, their shoulders, and their legs, we see the next big milestone for gross motor skill development, and that's at 2 months when children are able to sit while supported. That requires actually a lot of muscles that children aren't born with originally, but due to the development of the muscles, and in particular due to the development of the motor system that connects those muscles to the brain, children can balance themselves and actually have the strength to support themselves after about 2 months of age. At 6 months, children are able to actually not only sit while supported, but sit on their own. So they don't need anybody supporting them, they don't need anybody around them in order to sit upright. 2 months later, these gross motor skills develop even further, and children are typically able to stand very quickly after they're able to sit on their own. And that's because a lot of the leg muscles are already there. It just requires a lot of extra development of the nervous system in that particular area. At 10 to 12 months, after kind of being able to pull up themselves, children typically have the ability to stand on their own, but a month or 2 months later without needing the balance of somebody else or something to lean on. After being able to stand, it's a very, very quick transition to the next major gross motor skill, and it's the one that gets a lot of attention with parents, and that's the ability for a child to walk. Now, walking, despite the fact that most of us might not think about it very much, is actually a very intricate, coordinated system. You have to transition your weight from one leg to the next. You also have to be able to balance while you're transitioning that weight, while you're moving your feet up in a forward motion. And to do that, a child requires a lot of coordination with a lot of different systems in order to be able to master that. Surprisingly, when we look at walking, even though this is a really, really big milestone with parents, it doesn't seem to have anything really special to it in comparison to some of the other developmental processes. That whole ability to sit up on your own, the ability to stand, all of those things are programming a child and preparing them for that next big step, and that's the first step. But in infancy, especially with parents, that first step, that first ability to walk is something that a lot of people are very interested in studying, and in all reality is complex, but there's a lot of complex gross motor skills that are developing at the same exact time as walking. Now, when we look at walking, a first step for a child is typically very basic. It's on either a carpeted or a wooded floor that's very flat, and provides a lot of support for a child if they're going to fall. But as we develop in infancy, there's a lot of need to develop other types of walking skills. So dealing with different terrains, dealing with different angles, dealing with a lot of different things that might come up in the walking process. And this is definitely a learning process with this gross motor skill. As some of you probably have already seen a number of times in your life, infants between about the age of 1 to 2 really struggle with the walking process, and anything that is irregular in their environment can very often cause them to fall. And developing this particular skill is very critical and very, important for a child at this age to be able to do. As we progress later on, children begin to be able to stand alone easily at about the age of 1, start moving around with their arms and legs in a more orderly fashion. They also start to develop the ability to climb steps, but usually at this point in time it's a crawl. Speeding up their walking pace is something that they're able to do. And one interesting one that we don't usually think of as being very important, but it actually requires a lot of skill in terms of balance and motor coordination, is a child's ability to squat without falling. Hovering their weight over their hips, being able to balance themselves out, is actually a very intricate system. This is one of the processes that kids actually are able to do and develop at about the age of 1 or somewhere just after that. Children also typically have the ability to walk backward, and they start to master the ability to kick and throw a ball. Now, once again, just like walking, we might not recognize just by looking at it the intricacy to this, but kicking and throwing a ball actually requires a lot of balance and a lot of muscle coordination. Because if a child doesn't have that and they try to kick a ball, they'll inevitably fall down. So the ability to learn how to do this is another gross motor skill development between the ages of 1 to 2 that a child develops. And the last thing the child starts to master, even though they're definitely nowhere near the peak of their ability by the time they reach this stage, is the ability to jump. So the ability to actually leave the ground with both feet. At 3 to 4, much more intricate gross motor skills start to develop. Children learn to hop, to run, and in particular, one of the big ones that children learn is the ability to run and convert that into a hop. This is, in fact, one of the cuter things that you can see with little kids in terms of gross motor skill development, because when they learn this connection between running and jumping to a stop, they'll do this almost continuously for a short period of time. And this is something that they really are proud of, and something that really shows a mastering of a number of different types of gross motor skills. This run into a jump and not falling. Around 4 to 5 years of age, kids start to develop the ability to walk downstairs. This might seem a little late, but remember, walking downstairs requires a very different set of muscles and a very different set of skills than going upstairs. Kids can typically crawl downstairs much earlier than this, but the ability to actually walk downstairs only develops between about the ages of 4 to 5, and children also at around 5 start to develop very intricate coordinated movements. So they can move their arms in a very specific pattern. They can start to master things like sports and other events at around 4 to 5, and they get better and better as they progress past the age of 5 into adolescence, where experience really does shape the gross motor skill development after that point in time. So up to about the age of 5, there's a very set pattern that kids typically go through, but after about 5 years of age, kids really do develop motor skills, in particular gross motor skills, based on what they're doing. So if you have a child that plays basketball a lot, they're going to develop motor skills that relate to that particular activity. If you've got a child that likes to play another sport, or you've got a child that dances, or you've got a child that does other things that require different types of balance or different types of muscles, those particular motor skills are going to develop more rapidly than other ones. And if somebody doesn't do specific tasks, a lot of times when we get into adulthood after the age of 5, there will be discrepancies between the gross motor skill development of different individuals. Another thing that takes shape after about the age of 5 is not only specific gross motor skills, but a much smoother system of gross motor skills. If any of you have ever watched 4 and 5-year-olds trying to play a game of basketball or another sport, or even walking, you can see, even up to the age of 5, that their behavior is very choppy. There's not a real coherence to a lot of things, and it takes them a lot to transition from one activity to the next. Well, as we develop into adolescence, kids get better and better at behaving more smoothly. So their movement is less choppy, their movement is much more coordinated, and because of exposure to a lot of things, a child can become very, very good during adolescence at a number of specific tasks that involve these gross motor skills. As we move on beyond adolescence and get into adulthood, our motor system continues to develop. In fact, up to about the age of 30, we're getting better and better with a lot of our motor skills. But at the point in time when we reach 30, our motor systems start to decline. In particular, our gross motor systems start to decline. It's not a rapid drop, so if any of you are about the age of 30, don't worry. You're still at the peak of your ability for a number of years. But as you get into your 40s and 50s, you're going to see a slow decline of your ability to coordinate things, the ability to balance correctly, and the ability to move as well as you did, or at least had the ability to move as a younger individual. Now there's some exceptions to this. If somebody really starts exercising or really starts developing gross motor skills after the age of 30, they can actually have better gross motor skill development than they had before that, but the potential for gross motor skill ability is actually peaked at about the age of 30 for most individuals. And based on the level of activity that you have, based on whether or not you're training your muscles, you can see varying degrees of decline after about the age of 30. If somebody's very active, there will be minimal to no decline in gross motor skill ability, and in fact, if a person exercises more and works at their systems more, you could even see an increase in gross motor skills. But if a person completely stops being active at about the age of 30, you'll see a very sharp decline in gross motor ability. The other part of motor skills that we're interested in, when it's a little bit more specific, is something we call fine motor skills. These involve very small muscles. These involve very specific types of behaviors. And unlike gross motor skill development, when we look at fine motor skill ability, we see a huge variation from person to person in terms of the fine motor skill development that they have and the specific fine motor skills that they actually develop. Now, for most of us, all the way into adulthood, we're getting continually better at specific fine motor skills that we're trying to use. So if you've got a child that likes to type, they're getting better and better at typing, and they have the ability to get better and better at typing all the way up to the age of 30. If you've got a person that likes to write or a person that plays the piano, all of these fine motor skills tend to get much better and much quicker due to the coordination of the nervous system, so those neurons connecting to each other, and due to the myelination of those neurons that we have in our body. Experience is key for this particular type of motor skill. So even though in gross motor skills, experience kind of comes hand in hand, it's not essential for growth for us to see it. With fine motor skills, if you're not required to behave in a specific way, if you're not required to do specific tasks, you really won't develop most of the fine motor skills that you have the potential to develop. However, just like gross motor skills, as we get into later age, we lose a lot of fine motor skills as well. Just like gross motor skills, as you use them more often, you might lose less gross motor skills, but they tend to decline. And there's a couple causes for this. One of the big causes, one of the things that we see in a number of studies that might explain a lot of the decline in both gross and fine motor skills, but more fine motor skills, something that we call neural noise. And that's the fact that when our nervous system is trying to communicate with our brain, well, when our peripheral nervous system and our spinal cord is trying, or the nerves in our spinal cord is trying to communicate with our brain, at a young age we usually see a very obvious signal going from the body to the brain. But as we get older and older, one thing we see, which is very interesting, is that a lot of that signal tends to diffuse. It tends to go away. And instead of having a very noticeable blip, we get just a constant flutter of noise, of neural activity in our body that we can't really overcome. So instead of having our brain just try to pick up on one signal, it has to ignore some motor signals and pick up on others, or I guess some sensory signals and pick up on others, and that message from the brain, our body has to ignore some signals from the brain, or that seemingly are coming from the brain, and try to detect others. And that neural noise is believed to be a big cause of why we lose some of our fine motor skills and even our gross motor skills. More use of those skills, though, will slow the decline, but when we see a decline in fine motor skills, we can noticeably see it when that lack of action actually takes place. Surprisingly, though, despite the fact that we have to kind of use it to keep it, if you do use a fine motor skill, a number of studies have shown that people still maintain the ability to use those fine motor skills for a very long period of time. So there's instances of golfers who have a swing down packed and have that entire motion and that entire process in a very, very set pattern. And even if they lose the ability to walk, the ability to move, or even the ability to eat, they still maintain the ability to swing that golf club. Knitters can do this for years. Anybody with a hobby or anybody with an activity can usually maintain their fine motor skills if they're repetitively doing those tasks. That marks the end of our motor system. Now we're going to take a small break here. Please take as long as you need. Relax, get yourself refocused, and we're going to continue on with our sensory and perceptual systems in the next half of class.